One of the scenarios you're likely to come across when you're doing deer habitat management on your hunting property is that your hinge cut areas, whether you bought the property and somebody else did the hinging, or maybe you did it, you heard about the hinge cutting craze and so you just got the chainsaw out and started hinging down trees, or for some other reason you notice that deer aren't using your hinge cutting area. It's important to maintain that area and improve it in some cases in such a way as to benefit the deer on your property. I'm on a property here that I have a client who has asked me to not only do a deer property management plan for him, but also to carry out a number of management tasks, the actual work itself. This was previously hinge cut by another person, and I'm not a big fan of people criticizing others' work because everybody has a different approach, but I certainly wouldn't have hinge cut this area the way that it's been done. There are a lot of aspen trees in this hinge cut area. Aspens as a whole don't hinge cut very well. Probably 10% of them may survive, if that. And so you have a really soft wood that breaks down quite quickly. And what ends up happening is that dead material will, in just a couple of years, start breaking apart. So what you end up with is a big tangle of dead trees, and especially branches that just litter the forest floor. And deer will bed on small twigs and even tiny branches, but when it starts to get to an inch in diameter and bigger, they oftentimes will find a different place to bed. Furthermore, if places in the hinge cutting area don't have an escape route, or they only have one escape route, deer will rarely go in there except at night because they don't feel secure. They always want to have multiple ways to get out. So opening up the hinge cut area, as strange as it may sound, is very important. You can do this every single spring, just kind of walk through your hinge cut bedding areas. But in this case, it's been a number of years since this hinging has been done, and so this needs a real refurbishing. When you're hinge cutting for deer to bed in and have daytime browse, there's always this tender balance between having good cover but enough openings for the deer to be mobile and be able to get up, stretch, get something to eat, defecate and urinate, perhaps get something to drink if there's a watering hole in the area, and feel like they're secure, but at the same time feel like they're not enclosed and have no way to get out. So the first thing that you want to do when you're doing one of these rehab projects on your hinge cut areas is to make sure that you have plenty of travel corridors in the actual hinge cut area. Start out with maybe one or two big ones, and when I say big, maybe 3 feet wide or so, that extend the whole way through the hinge cut area. And then add some tertiary paths for the deer to travel on to actually get to their beds. Oftentimes in the center of a hinge cut, you can even leave a bigger opening because they feel secure with the hinge cut around them, and it gives them extra space to be able to move around. Additionally, it gives the deer extra food to browse on during the day. After you've made your pathways, then you can start carving out the beds. In some cases, the deer may have already created those beds, and I always encourage people, if they've already made a bed, there's a reason they made a bed there. So just build off of that. In some cases, it's as simple as just removing the dead branches that have fallen over the winter, or perhaps have just decayed over time from the hinging. And if I find something like this in the bed, that's definitely got to go. Even a little bit smaller, I like to clean that out. If it's down to a 1/2 inch, they'll tolerate that as long as it's not something that's poking up into their body. So I just cast that off to the side, and I've got a nice bed here. I like to think about bedding, especially for does, and this is right beside a food plot, and so this is going to be, for the most part, doe bedding. I want to think about putting doe family groups together. So each little area within this tiny little 1/8 of an acre hinge cut area, I'm going to create maybe 3 different spots where anywhere from 3 to 6 does and their fawns can bed together. Now, I certainly don't believe that there'll be 3 different doe groups using that 1/8 acre at the same time to bed in. But what I can do is give them a little bit of variety so that they're not always in the same spots. And that allows browse to grow out over time so that they're not hammering the same location every single day. It also gives them the opportunity to find places where they feel secure on different winds and different weather experiences, and even based on where they've encountered predators in the past. Make sure every single bed that you clean out has at least 2 exits, and even a 3rd exit isn't bad. That doesn't always mean that you have to clear out a path for an exit, because deer can obviously jump. A third and really important thing that you want to consider when you're rehabbing a hinge cut bedding area is to make sure that you can get to your stand without going through that area, because most likely the deer will be bedded in it when you go into your stand. In this case, there's actually a stand that this client has on his property between 2 little hinge cut areas right on the edge of the food plot. He has another one that is on the far end of one of those hinge cut areas. And that one is much easier to get into because he can circle around and then just take a straight line to his stand so that he has minimal contact with that hinge cut bedding area. So I've actually recommended that he remove the stand that's in the middle of these 2 hinge cut areas and utilize the other one. It does no good to have a world-class hinge cutting bedding area for deer if you blow the deer out when you go to your hunting stand. So always think about the ramifications of how you're going to get into that stand, and think about the winds in your area as well. If the wind is typically coming from a certain direction, think about that as part of your entry into your hunting stand, and adjust your hunting stands if you have to make sure that you can get into them safely. And a fourth thing I want to consider when I'm rehabbing a hinge cut area is that on this specific property, right in this area, around this food plot, there are 3 distinct hinge cut areas. 2 of them are about 1/8 of an acre in size, and the third one is quite a bit bigger, probably 5/8 to 3/4 of an acre, maybe even an acre in size. And so one of the nice things, especially as it relates to doe bedding in hinge cut areas, is that you can really stack a lot of does into a small area as long as you create buffer space. In each of these 3 areas, and most dramatically on the 2 smaller hinge cut areas that are only about 1/8 of an acre in size and to the east of the food plot, I actually am making sure that the beds are on the farther side away from the other bedding area. That gives me a better chance of stacking more doe families in this area to put them in a concentrated place for the hunter to be able to have success in harvesting doe. And also during the rut, that becomes a location that can be a magnet for bucks as they're scent checking does in these concentrated bedding areas. A 5th way that you can rehab your old and dying hinge cut areas is to rehinge some of the growth. When trees start getting above 5-6 feet, deer can't reach them anymore. And ideally, 3 to 4 feet is kind of their comfort zone. So yes, if they're desperate to eat, they'll get up on their hind legs and they'll browse to as high as they can reach. But you don't want your herd in desperation. So one of the things you can do is re-hinge cut those living hinges that have survived the initial cut. For your larger trees, you may want to use a chainsaw, but for the new growth, the ones that are maybe 1 or 2 inches in diameter, a handsaw is often the best way to go. Similarly, if you find a log that has new growth, but it was cut really, really high, maybe somebody else did it for you or you did it and it was something that you didn't really know what you were doing at the time, you can cut that down lower, say about 2.5 feet or somewhat lower than that. And then new growth will sprout out of that stump almost right away, especially if you have trees like maple and box elder and ash and linden and other trees that quickly regrow. And that will be a highly nutritious source of food for deer because that entire stump used to feed an entire tree. And now all it's doing is feeding a couple of shoots that are being sent up. You can probably see some of the growth on these hinges behind me. Some of them reach 20 feet into the air already. And so you can actually bring that down because there's next to no browse in here for the deer because the growth has gone straight up and there's nothing left that survived on the horizontal. Of course, you don't have to feel like you have to rehinge every single hinge cut tree or anything that's starting to grow that's new. Deer like a variety, and so you can leave a couple of trees for shade and just to knock down the air to give thermal cover for the deer besides the hinging that's already been done. So be selective. Again, choose variety. Deer like a variety of things. That's why they live on transition areas and edges almost all the time. I always think that it pays off to think things through before you start cutting. And one of the things that I've noticed in this hinge cut area is right here, this is a hawthorn tree. And I'm going to actually save this. I don't want to do anything to this because I actually want this to grow out. Hawthorn, while it produces those tiny little apple-like fruits, are not a top choice for deer, but they would make great daytime food. So I'm going to let this grow up in this bedding area because it'll meet the needs of the deer during the day, but it won't prevent them from coming out into the food plot. In fact, I wouldn't even hesitate to leave perhaps 1 or 2 apple trees on the fringe of that bedding area if you have a couple that are coming up. Here are a few tips that I believe can help save you some headaches, and in some cases I mean that quite literally. Whether you use a chainsaw or not, I highly recommend that you have some kind of head protection, a hard hat of some sort. You will not believe how many times you'll go to stand up and knock your head against a hinged tree. Don't ask me how I know that that takes place. A second thing to think about, make sure that when you're creating these main trails and even the tertiary trails, that you don't go more than 10, 12, at the most 15 feet until a deer has the option to veer off in a different direction. You want them to have multiple escape routes. They ironically feel more secure when the hinge cut area is opened up in its interior a little bit. The denseness actually boxes them in so that they can't get out, and that creates panic in the animals and they won't actually go in to that hinge cut area to bed. They won't feel secure. So there's almost this artistic element to creating these hinge cut areas where your open spaces are defined by the spaces that aren't open, and you want to make sure that you've got a good balance between the two. If you use any kind of power machinery whatsoever, I shouldn't have to say this, but I will, make sure that you use all the right safety gear. For ear protection, eye protection, if you're using a chainsaw, make sure you're using chaps. Oftentimes we're in a rush. We get home from work and we've got like 30 minutes left of daylight, so we grab the chainsaw and go running, but we don't take our safety gear with us, and that's when a lot of the accidents happen because we're hurrying. So make sure you take the extra couple minutes to put on the safety gear and to use it all the time. And lastly, while deer won't knock back dead branches for the most part, if there's anything that's alive, as long as it's browsable, let the deer take care of that. They'll actually kind of mow their own path down for themselves. So if you've got living hinge cut growth, just let them browse that down. And that will also be one way that you can go back in a couple of weeks to see if they've been using that hinge cut area that they haven't been using in the past. If you like my material, please like, subscribe, share, and turn on the notifications for my YouTube channel. I'll continue to make as much deer hunting and wildlife content as possible. And now, until next time, I'm Daryl Meyer with Seeds to Dreams Deer, and I hope you find more than you think you're hunting for.